Now, one of the authors that you brought into this book was Nathaniel Hawthorne, and I never thought of Nathaniel as really a fantasy writer. How did you come to choose him?
Well, he's actually often in fantasy genre circles cited as one of the first American fantasy writers for a handful of his short stories. And we weren't at first sure because most of what we looked through on his didn't really seem to fit. But this one story, had those elements and showed a lighter touch in a weird way. It's like he got to access a different part of his creativity with this Feathertop story, I think it was called, yeah.
The other thing that we try to do when we do these anthologies is look for the connections and the influences between the different writers. And, of course, when we were doing our research, we saw that there was definitely a connection between Hawthorne and Melville and Edgar Allan Poe as well. So, just finding all those different philosophical connections between those writers and putting them together in the same anthology, it's like they get to have this conversation, and we like to do that.
And speaking of the conversation, Edgar Allan Poe, who Anne mentioned, is a really interesting case because he was one of the few American writers and writers of horror and fantasy who was translated very early. So a lot of the other writers in this collection, especially the European ones, had access to translations in German and Italian and other languages, almost just a couple years after Poe's stories came out. And so it's really fascinating to see how in so many different ways, not just all the different kinds of stories he wrote, but the influence he had early on, how he pretty much helped create a whole era of fantasy, horror, and science fiction.
As a matter of fact, one of the Russian writers that we have in here, Alexander Grin, was a huge fan of Edgar Allan Poe, and there was a talk about whether or not he carried around a photograph of him in his coat pocket all the time.
Really?
Yes.
What an interesting piece of trivia.
I read that somewhere. I don't know how true it is, but I'm hoping that that's true because I think that's very cool. But he also did some of the translations of Poe's work into German. Into Russian.
Yeah.
So definitely Poe was a huge influence all over Europe for the reasons that Jeff said, and that was just another connection that we found.
Mm-hmm. Well, I noticed that you have a lot of very familiar authors in here, but one that really stuck out. And again, I have to reference my childhood because I read Louisa May Alcott when I was in the second grade. That's when I started reading her. And to see her in this collection is like, hey, I was on top of things and didn't even know it. I was just a kid, but I loved them all.
Yeah, I think that particular story she had written, if I remember correctly, she had written it to entertain some other children. And so that's why she was writing those kind of stories.
I believe you're correct. Yep.
Yes.
That sounds very correct.
Well, I do. I mean, think about that. It's like you have a bunch of kids, children of your friends, and you want to entertain them. You just make up these stories, and how cool is that? So I thought that was really cool.
Now, the one that I did not recognize, and I still don't recognize, is W.E.B. Du Bois.
Mm-hmm.
What can you tell me about this author?
Well, Du Bois was a very interesting writer. He is known mostly for his nonfiction writings, and he wrote an awful lot of fiction as well. And we were very excited to be able to find this story from 1910, which had never been published before. So that was something that we were excited to find in a literary journal.
Well, he was a huge African American scholar and thinker and wrote a lot of nonfiction. Most of the fiction he wrote was not published during his lifetime. And in fact, one thing that's really amazing is the story that we published was the literal manuscript pages were photographed and posted on a academic journal site, and that's how we found it. But there was a whole trunk full of his fiction, which turned out to almost all be fantasy and science fiction that should come out in the next couple of years. And it's really fascinating because if this African-American writer, who was writing around, 1910 or so, if all of that stuff had been published at the time, who knows how it would have changed the future of fantasy. But in fact, he considered it to be kind of like a lark. And even though he loved pulp magazines and things, he just didn't think about getting it published at the time.
That's fascinating. I notice you also have H.G. Wells in here and John Collier. There are so many wonderful authors in this. I can only imagine how long it must have taken you to build this collection.
I feel like we've been working on it all our lives.
Well, I mean, it's true, because as we've done the earlier anthologies, we thought we might do a fantasy anthology down the line. So things that weren't right for the other anthologies but might be right for this, we've been flagging. So this one actually, I think, took less time, and don't you think, than some of the others, because we already had some of these stories in our site.
We did.
So 18 months?
We've pretty much been building up what we thought we might want, particular stories and also particular writers, as the years have gone by. So when it was time to sit down and actually do the work, it didn't take us nearly as long as we thought it would for that reason.
Wow. That's awesome. Now, in the list of books that you all have out there, I noticed that there was a series, I think it's a series, of Born, B-O-R-N-E.
Oh, my novel, Born?
Yes. Is that part of a trilogy?
Well, actually, I have something called the Southern Reach Trilogy, which is Annihilation, Authority, and Acceptance, and Born is kind of it's part of like a series of 3 books that are kind of related, but you can read each one of them without having read the others. So Born is the first one, and then one called Strange Bird, and then the novel I have coming out this fall, set in the same basic kind of post-apocalyptic future, is called Dead Astronauts. And they're all set in this city where biotech has kind of gone awry, and they do kind of have kind of a fantasy feel in that, you know, some of the more advanced science and the ways we look at science does begin to feel almost like magic. And so, if you're not technical or not a scientist, then and that's the character point of view, then it almost does feel like magic when you encounter certain things.
Wow, that's amazing. I love the way that your illustrators build your covers for your books. They're not only good to read, but they're attractive. They stand out. Who does your illustrations for you?
Well, a wide variety depending on the publisher, but we usually have a lot of input into the look and feel, and we have a kind of a sense of the aesthetic and kind of the brand that we kind of represent. So we've been lucky to work with a lot of different great designers.
Yeah, we've pretty much, each of us separately and then together, have spent our entire lives surrounded by beautiful artwork. Jeff's mother is an artist, and my parents were art collectors, so we've always had beautiful art around us. So the design, the look and feel of our projects has always been very important to us. Yeah,
and I think it's an important entry point to the reader. If you get that wrong, then you're kind of already wrong-footed before they even get to the text. So I think it's really incredibly important to set the right mood with the artwork. And I really like the Big Book of Classic Fantasies cover because I feel like it conveys something very comfortable and beautiful, and yet also a little strange, a little off. So it kind of conveys the strangeness and wildness of the collection too.
What I like about the illustration on the Big Book Classic Fantasy is the fact that the woman in the picture seems though that she could be either a character in a story or a person looking for the story. And with the moons and the stars, each one could represent one of the stories in the collection, and she has to choose which one she wants to read.
Oh, that's a beautiful interpretation of the cover.
That really is. I like that too.
That's what it appealed to me. I mean, I look at this, and that's what comes to my mind. And it's the artwork has always spoken to me, but I love the books. Your steampunk covers are awesome.
Thank you.
I love those. And I know nothing about steampunk, so Mad Max is about as close as I ever get.
And I think the funny thing about that is that having done so many steampunk books, I don't know if we could tell you what it is at this point because we've done so much of it, we're burned out.
Oh, I bet. But it's been the rage for quite a while with our younger generation now.
Yeah. And those books are still in print. Yeah.
Yeah, and what's nice about it is because of the covers, they're more likely to pick up that book and see what it is. And I'm a big advocate for getting our kids to read.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and we do. We actually field test some of this stuff at Shared Worlds, this teen writing camp that we teach at and help run. And so every summer we're in Spartanburg, South Carolina at Wofford College teaching 60 kids from all over the country, along with some other writers. And, sometimes they get to see these projects in process. And we encourage that because we're teaching them to write, but it's also good for them to see what an editor does and how a book is put together and get into the nuts and bolts of it and kind of really get a chance to kind of participate in a way. And, they influence us, too, because they give us their reading recommendations. And it's also good to see that the next generation reads physical books. You hear about the death of the book a lot, but I actually think a lot of teenagers today prefer the physical book, and it's really the 30 or 40-somethings who are talking about the death of the book and read e-books, which is kind of funny.
Right. I totally agree, and I would love to continue this conversation when I'm in Miami with the other authors that I'll be interviewing. I hope to be able to come and see you both while you're there, and I'd love to have you autograph my book for me. But for our audience out there, tell everyone where they can get this big book of classic fantasy by Anne and Jeff VANDERMEER.
Well, really, at your favorite independent bookstore or wherever it is you hang out that are books, they should have this anthology.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I wish you all the best success. Thank you so much for sharing these stories with the public and the world, and I can't wait to see what comes up next.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you so much, and thanks for your kind words about our project.
Thanks.
I think it's a great project. I loved it. And we will see you in Miami.
I look forward to it.
So, you've been listening to the Society Bites radio station, and I'm your host, Kate O'Neill, and we've been speaking with Anne and Jeff VANDERMEER today. So, everyone out there, keep reading.
Thanks for coming in. See you tomorrow. Remember, the topic is always hot. And oh hey, don't forget your change.